Saipan, summer 1945. The island still smelled of burnt coral and aviation fuel. Less than a year earlier, it had been a battlefield. Now Kagman Field buzzed with the disciplined rhythm of victory. Engines coughed awake at dawn, ground crews shouted over the whine of generators, and the once contested runways of Saipan had become the forward eyes of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Among the many silver aircraft lined nose to tail stood a sleek twin-boom machine marked F-5B Lightning 4268204, nicknamed Lucky Lou. The nose art showed a cartoon pinup in red heels lounging atop a film reel, paint beginning to peel from the salt air. It wasn't a fighter anymore. Every trace of its original firepower, 4.50 caliber guns and a 20mm cannon, had been removed. In their place sat 3 cameras behind flat optical ports, 2 K-17s for vertical shots, and 1 K-22 oblique for side angles. Where other Lightnings fired bullets, Lucky Lou fired light. The eyes of the Pacific. By mid-1945, the Allies controlled most of the Central Pacific, but they still needed precise imagery of every runway, lagoon, and ridge between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. From Saipan, reconnaissance pilots of the 28th Photo-Reconnaissance Squadron could reach the Bonin Islands, Truk Lagoon, and even Kyushu itself. Their maps guided the Navy's carriers, the Marines' landings, and the B-29 routes that thundered north from Tinian and Guam. On the morning of June 17, 1945, Technical Sergeant Harold or Hal Mason, chief photo technician, inspected Lucky Lou's camera bay. Each lens was cleaned with alcohol and gauze. Film magazines the size of lunchboxes loaded with Eastman aerial stock clicked into place. Mason sealed the access panel and scrawled the mission data on masking tape. Mission R443, target, Okinawa Sector North. First Lieutenant Robert E. Jensen, a 23-year-old Minnesotan who had flown 31 sorties without firing a single round, climbed into the cockpit. His flying suit was patched, his hair sun-bleached. On the flight line, Crew Chief Staff Sergeant Tony DeMarco handed him a folded paper, the weather forecast and fuel plan. "Keep her high and cold, Bob. Don't let the flak boys say hello." Jensen grinned. No guns? No problem. Unarmed and alone. An F-5B carried no escort. Its survival depended on altitude and speed, over 400 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The polished aluminum reflected the sky, nearly invisible except for twin vapor trails that traced across the Pacific. If intercepted by Zeros, Jensen's only defense was a dive toward cloud cover and prayer. As 00600 hours luckily rolled down the coral strip, twin Allison engines roaring, the Lightning left off the runway and banked northeast toward open ocean. Below, palm trees whipped in the prop wash. On the horizon, B-29s formed up for their own raids. Within minutes, the island shrank to a speck behind him. For 7 hours, Jensen flew a solitary triangle route. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, return. The sun blazed off the wings, sweat soaked his gloves. When he crossed the Ryukyus, he descended through thin cirrus, switching the intervolumina that triggered the cameras every few seconds. The aircraft's belly rattled with the click-whir of shutters. Each frame captured shoreline, docks, anti-aircraft pits, intelligence more valuable than gold. At 27,000 feet, contrails from Japanese interceptors appeared briefly, then faded. None came close. Perhaps they mistook the F-5 for an armed P-38. Perhaps they simply had nothing left to scramble. Return to Kagman. By mid-afternoon, Lucky Lou streaked back over the Mariana Trench, low on fuel. He contacted Kagman Tower. Photo-recon R443 inbound. Request straight in. The controller cleared him, and within minutes, the twin-boom Lightning touched down hard on the coral strip, bouncing once before settling. Crew trucks rushed forward. Mason and DeMarco climbed onto the wing before the props stopped turning. "Welcome back, Lucky Lou," Mason said, helping Jensen unbuckle. The pilot's face was salt-crusted, eyes bloodshot, but his grin was intact. "Got the whole island, every square mile," he rasped. The ground crew slid open the camera bay. The smell of hot metal and film emulsion filled the air. Each magazine was labeled, wrapped, and carried to the photo lab, a Quonset hut humming with enlargers and dryers. Inside, technicians developed miles of negatives in large chemical baths. Within hours, analysts were spreading fresh prints across light tables, tracing airfields and counting aircraft shelters. One photograph revealed a new supply depot north of Naha. Another showed anti-aircraft guns repositioned overnight. By dusk, intelligence officers had redlined the findings and radioed them to the 20th Air Force. A routine of risk. This routine repeated nearly every day. Kagman's F-5 crews were among the busiest in the Pacific. Missions ranged from pre-strike mapping to post-raid assessment, flying over smoke-covered targets to confirm destruction. Occasionally, an aircraft failed to return. Pilots simply disappeared over endless ocean, victims of engine failure or unseen enemy fire. There were no parachutes spotted, no wrecks recovered, just another name added to the operations board. Lucky Lou survived where many did not. Some said it was luck, others credited Jensen's steady hand. Once, returning from the bone end, a coolant leak forced him to shut down the right engine halfway home. He feathered the prop, trimmed the rudder, and coaxed the Lightning 600 miles on one motor, landing at Saipan with fumes in the tanks. Mason etched a small shamrock on the fuselage after that flight. The bigger picture. Behind the daily grind lay a shift in how wars were fought. For the first time, aerial photography allowed commanders to wage a campaign of precision. The Pacific's endless islands were charted not by explorers, but by these silent recon planes. Every invasion map, every bombing plan, and every naval bombardment started with the negatives shot by unarmed pilots like Jensen. They turned geography into intelligence, and intelligence into power. Even as atomic bombs loomed on the horizon, the crews at Kagman kept flying. Their cameras documented the dying empire beneath them, ruined harbors, shattered railways, and the thin smoke of cities bombed into silence. Yet their photographs also captured evidence for future historians, frames that still rest in archives today. On August 10, 1945, with Japan preparing to surrender, Lucky Lou flew one final mission, mapping Tokyo Bay for the approaching occupation forces. Jensen, weary but proud, circled above a city that had burned for months. From 30,000 feet, he photographed the harbors where peace would soon be signed. It was his 38th sortie. When he landed back at Saipan, mechanics met him with a bucket of cold water and laughter. Mason scrawled on the nose, 38 and done. Within weeks, the 28th Photo-Recon Squadron began dismantling its tents. Some planes were shipped back to the States. Others, including Lucky Lou, were left behind. Too worn to fly, too costly to ferry home. Mechanics drained its fuel and removed the cameras. For a while, she sat at the edge of Kagman Field, her aluminum skin oxidizing in the tropical air. Children later played in her shadow when the island turned to peace. Jensen returned home in October 1945. In interviews years later, he said he never thought of himself as a hero. All I did was take pictures, he laughed, but those pictures helped end a war. The silent hero. The story of Lucky Lou is emblematic of the quiet, unglamorous courage that defined reconnaissance aviation. No dogfights, no medals for kills, just lonely flights through flak and storms, capturing moments on film that others would use to plan the next step. These pilots fought not with bullets but with clarity. They brought order to chaos, light to darkness, and truth to history. When historians later pieced together the Pacific campaign, they found the fingerprints of the F-5 crews on every victory map. Without them, the Allies would have been blind. And somewhere, in a box of negatives labeled Saipan, June 1945, lies the world as Lucky Lou saw it. Clouds drifting over a shimmering ocean, a chain of volcanic islands, and the thin silver trail of a Lightning returning home. When Lockheed engineers in Burbank first rolled out the P-38 Lightning in 1939, they could not have guessed that its most valuable version would be one without guns. The twin-boom fighter had been designed as a long-range interceptor meant to chase bombers at impossible speeds. Its distinctive twin tails, tricycle landing gear, and sleek nose made it look like something from the future. By 1943, however, commanders in every theater had begun carving open those noses and installing cameras instead of cannons. Out of that experiment came the F-4 and later the F-5, aircraft that turned reconnaissance into an art form. Stripping the guns. A normal P-38 carried 5 weapons in its nose. The F-5 carried none. Technicians removed the ammunition trays and installed camera mounts, oxygen bottles, and electrical relays. The empty gun ports were sealed with aluminum plates, and a cluster of cameras, usually 3 to 5 depending on mission, was fitted behind optically flat glass. Each camera weighed over 40 pounds and used rolls of film that could stretch more than 150 feet. At 30,000 feet, the plane could photograph an area 40 miles wide in a single run. Inside, the pilot sat alone. There was no navigator, no gunner, and no one to share the workload. The oxygen system was modified for flights that might last 8 hours. Heating pads were added to gloves and boots, but at high altitude they often failed. Men returned with frostbitten fingers even in the tropics. What replaced the roar of machine guns was a rhythmical click and whir, the mechanical heartbeat of the cameras. To those who flew them, the F-5 felt less like a weapon and more like a flying laboratory. Speed as armor. Commanders who first saw the unarmed Lightnings were uneasy. Sending a pilot hundreds of miles into enemy territory with no guns seemed reckless. But speed and altitude were armor of their own. The twin Allison engines could push it past 400 miles per hour, and the superchargers let it climb above most Japanese fighters. Its slim profile made it difficult to spot. In daylight, the polished skin mirrored the color of the sea. In twilight, it disappeared completely. Reconnaissance pilots quickly developed tactics suited to their vulnerability. They flew alone to avoid drawing attention, hugging the clouds until the target appeared, then diving to camera altitude. Shutter switches on the yoke let them photograph without taking hands off the controls. Once the film was exposed, they climbed again, throttling back to conserve fuel for the long trip home. Aerial reconnaissance had existed before the war. Balloons in World War I, occasional modified bombers in the 1930s, but never with this reach or precision. The F-5 could map entire island chains in a single sortie. It was the perfect tool for the geography of the Pacific, where every reef and volcano mattered. Intelligence in silver frames. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had built an entire network of photo-recon squadrons. On Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, their huts were stacked with developing tanks and light tables. Crews worked through the night translating film into intelligence. Analysts measured bomb craters, counted airplanes, traced roads, and even studied the length of shadows to estimate building heights. A single roll of film might generate hundreds of prints. Those images determined whether a Marine battalion would storm a beach or whether a bomber wing would shift its aim a few hundred yards. Every decision, attack, defend, delay, began with a photograph. Pilots seldom saw what their film revealed. After landing, they handed the canisters to photo technicians and walked away, trusting that someone far up the chain would make sense of the negatives. But the results were dramatic. It was F-5 imagery that located hidden airfields in the Carolines, spotted the new airstrip on Iwo Jima before the invasion, and confirmed that the Japanese fleet at Truk Lagoon had been destroyed. A dangerous assignment. Despite their speed, the F-5 Lightnings were not invulnerable. Anti-aircraft fire remained their greatest threat. Japanese gunners learned to fire blind into the thin contrails crossing high above. One burst at the wrong time could shatter the cameras or puncture the coolant lines, forcing a pilot to ditch hundreds of miles from help. Many did not return. Loss rates for reconnaissance units rivaled bomber crews, yet they received little recognition because their missions were classified. Families at home often heard only that a loved one was missing after a photographic operation. The full details would remain buried in squadron diaries for decades. One pilot from the 6th Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron later wrote, "You flew over the enemy, but you weren't supposed to fight him. Your job was to see everything and be seen by no one." Lockheed's Precision Tool. Lockheed refined the design through each production block. The F-5A came first, built from the early P-38E and F models. The F-5B, like Lucky Lou, was based on the P-38J and carried larger camera windows and more fuel. Later versions, the F-5E and F-5G, featured pressurized cabins and advanced optics. Every modification aimed at one goal: clarity. Engineers installed gyroscopic stabilizers to reduce blur, heating elements to prevent frost on lenses, and even small periscopic sights so pilots could aim the cameras precisely. A good photograph demanded perfect coordination. Altitude, angle, sun position, and timing all had to align. Skilled recon pilots spoke of flying the frame, positioning their aircraft so the subject filled the negative just right. To achieve that, they memorized the terrain. Without GPS or radar altimeters, they navigated by islands, cloud shapes, and compass headings scribbled on kneeboards. Over Japan's mountainous coastlines, one wrong valley could mean death. Why the tanks were unprotected. The same design philosophy that produced the F-5 also explained the mystery of the unprotected fuel tanks that would puzzle American pilots when they examined captured Japanese aircraft. Japanese engineers favored range over survivability. Lockheed and the U.S. Army Air Forces took the opposite lesson. A recon Lightning had to bring its film home no matter what. Its fuel system was self-sealing, its lines armored. Every improvement aimed at endurance and safety for the single pilot who carried the eyes of the fleet. Yet even with these measures, missions pushed the limits. The Pacific was vast. A miscalculated wind could empty tanks an hour before a home base. Many F-5s carried emergency die markers and tiny survival kits. The pilots knew that if they went down, their odds were slim. From tool to doctrine. By late 1944, reconnaissance was no longer a support function, it was doctrine. The U.S. Army issued orders that no major operation could proceed without aerial photographs taken within the previous 72 hours. The F-5 squadrons became the first stop in any battle plan. At Kagman Field, officers from infantry and naval units queued outside the photo hut to request new coverage. "We need the east side of Okinawa again," or "Find us where they're hiding those barges." Each morning, the mission board filled with chalk lines assigning targets. By nightfall, the rolls of film returned and the process began again. Among themselves, recon crews developed a quiet pride. They were not aces. They didn't paint kill marks on fuselages. Their bragging rights came from perfect exposures and cloudless runs. Ground crews treated them with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "You're flying all that way with no guns?" they'd ask. "That's suicide." The pilots would shrug. "If they can't catch me, they can't kill me." They tinkered constantly, polishing the aluminum for better camouflage, adjusting camera intervals, sharing tricks for evading flak. Each improvement passed informally from one crew to the next. The planes became personal. Names like Lucky Lou, Recon Rita, and Pacific Eyes adorned their noses. Beyond the Pacific. F-5 Lightnings also served in Europe, Africa, and Burma, photographing everything from the beaches of Normandy to the roads of China. But it was over the Pacific that their endurance truly mattered. Distances were enormous, weather unpredictable, and navigation primitive. The men who flew there felt both isolated and essential, the first to see new islands, the last to be thanked for it. Their work created a visual record of the war's final years. When peace came, those negatives filled warehouses from Hawaii to Washington, D.C. Many remain classified or forgotten, but they capture an entire world in transition. Jungle airstrips sprouting from coral, fleets at anchor, cities before and after firebombing. An unsung legacy. The F-5B Lightning represented more than a modification of a fighter. It symbolized a turning point in how armies perceived knowledge. A photograph could be as decisive as a bomb. Pilots like Jensen and his Lucky Lou proved that victory often depended not on destruction, but on understanding. When the last Lightnings were retired in 1946, a few went to civilian survey companies. The rest were scrapped. Yet their lineage continued directly into the Cold War's reconnaissance aircraft, the RB-26 Invader, the RB-50 Superfortress, and ultimately the U-2. The idea remained the same: see first, strike wisely. At Lockheed's factory, engineers who had worked on the F-5 moved on to the next generation of spy planes. Some kept tiny prints from the Pacific pinned above their desks, islands photographed from 30,000 feet, coastlines traced in silver light. They knew that the clarity of those images had shortened the war. Epilogue to a machine. If you visit Saipan today, Kagman Field is quiet. Jungle creeps across the old runways, but pieces of aluminum still glint among the grass. Locals occasionally find a rusted control column or a corroded camera lens. Most don't know what they are holding, yet each fragment once belonged to the machine that changed how war was seen. The F-5B Lightning never fired a shot, yet it helped aim millions. Its crews fought their war with film and sunlight.
trusting that knowledge itself was the sharpest weapon of all.
By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached its final and most perilous stage. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had been secured, and from those volcanic islands, the U.S. Army Air Forces could finally strike Japan itself. The B-29 superfortresses would carry the bombs, but before a single aircraft lifted off, the F-5B Lightnings had to lead the way. They were the eyes of the invasion. Every bombing route, every target list, every map of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka began as a strip of film inside a reconnaissance Lightning. The mission briefings. Each morning, at Kagman Field or Isley Air Base, pilots filed into canvas-walled briefing huts before sunrise. A chalk map on the wall outlined the route, a line stretching north over endless blue ocean toward Japan. The intelligence officers gave the standard reminder: you'll be flying alone. No escort, no radio chatter unless you're in trouble. The pilot's name was written on a small card beside the words Recon Run 47, or Mission Number 83. Altitude, 31,000 feet. Estimated time over target, 1437 hours. Return ETA, 2010 hours. The pilots memorized every detail. They would be airborne for 7 to 9 hours, much of it over open water, with no navigation aids. If their compass failed or clouds obscured the stars, they'd have to trust dead reckoning and luck. Into the north winds. From Saipan's coral runway, the F-5B's twin Allison engines screamed into life. The aircraft lifted smoothly, its polished silver reflecting the morning sun. Within minutes, the island shrank behind it and only ocean remained, an empty shimmering expanse broken occasionally by cloud shadows. Over the Philippine Sea, temperatures at altitude plunged to minus 40 degrees F. Frost crept across the inside of the canopy. The pilot toggled the heaters, flexing his gloved hands to keep blood flowing. In the nose, the camera shutters clicked rhythmically every few seconds, the soundproofed compartments whirring like the gears of a watch. Hours passed in silence. There was no radio conversation, only the muted vibration of engines and the hiss of oxygen through the mask. The first glimpse of Japan always came as a shock, a dark green coastline emerging from silver haze, snow dusting the mountains beyond. Mapping the homeland. These missions were not random flights. By 1945, the U.S. had launched Project Starfish, a top-secret effort to map the entire Japanese homelands in preparation for the planned invasion, Operation Downfall. Each pilot carried a segment of that massive mosaic, a flight path overlapping by inches with another pilot's route, creating a continuous photographic map that would later cover every city, harbor, and valley. The F-5B's cameras captured extraordinary detail. From 30,000 feet, they could record the curve of Tokyo Bay, the layout of shipyards in Yokosuka, or even the orderly rows of factory windows in Nagoya. Analysts in Guam could count trucks, trace rail lines, and identify new anti-aircraft batteries by the shape of their blast pits. It was the most comprehensive aerial survey ever attempted during wartime. Encounters in the sky. Despite their isolation, the F-5 pilots were rarely alone. Japanese radar stations detected the intruders, and fighter groups scrambled to intercept. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Air Force was diminished, but not blind. K-84 Hayates and occasional Zeros still patrolled the homeland skies. When spotted, the F-5 pilot's only defense was altitude and nerve. He would shove the throttles forward, diving steeply to gain speed, then level out into cloud cover. On one recorded mission over Kyushu, Lieutenant Charles W. Brown, flying an F-5B nicknamed Silver Ghost, was chased for nearly 30 minutes by 2 Japanese fighters. He evaded them by flying through a snow squall and climbed back to 35,000 feet, continuing his photo run as if nothing had happened. Another pilot, Lieutenant George "Red" McLaren wasn't so lucky. On March 18, 1945, his Lightning was hit by anti-aircraft shells while photographing Cove Harbor. The right engine caught fire. Witnesses saw the plane glide out to sea trailing smoke. No parachute appeared. His footage was lost with him. These dangers were constant, but the pilots kept flying. They understood that every photograph mattered. Every image could save thousands of lives in the invasions to come. Tokyo before the firestorms. Some of the most haunting images ever taken during World War II came from these flights. In February 1945, before the firebombing of Tokyo, F-5Bs captured crystal-clear views of the capital's crowded districts. Wooden houses packed tight like matchsticks, canals glimmering between them. When those photos were compared with images taken after the March 9 through 10th raid, the contrast was staggering. Square miles of city had turned to ash. Analysts realized just how devastating the bombing had been, and also how resilient the Japanese urban layout remained. These before and after photos guided future targeting, showing which industrial zones still operated. They also revealed something unexpected. Japan's aircraft production had not collapsed. F-5 imagery identified hidden underground assembly lines in Nagoya and Matsumoto. That discovery shifted Allied planning, leading to new strikes that crippled Japan's remaining aircraft capacity by June. The search for Yamato. One of the F-5B's most famous missions came in April 1945, the hunt for the Yamato, the world's largest battleship. When intelligence hinted that the ship had left port to attack the Okinawa invasion fleet, reconnaissance Lightnings were sent to locate her. Flying at the edge of their range, the F-5s photographed an enormous wake moving south from the inland sea. Within hours, analysts confirmed it was the Yamato, 72,000 tons of armor and guns steaming to its death. The next day, U.S. carrier aircraft intercepted and sank it. The photographs taken by those F-5s are still archived today, black and white proof that a camera could accomplish what radar could not. Operation Iceberg and the kamikaze threat. As the invasion of Okinawa unfolded in April 1945, F-5 Lightnings flew daily missions over the Ryukyu Islands. Their task? Find hidden airfields launching kamikaze attacks. The Japanese had begun dispersing suicide aircraft in farm clearings and caves, covering them with netting. Only the F-5's high-resolution images could reveal the faint tire marks and shadows that betrayed these sites. One analyst later recalled, "We learned to read the land like detectives. A patch of grass flattened, a broken line of trees, that meant another kamikaze strip." These findings allowed the Navy to bomb and strafe the hidden runways before more attacks could be launched. Countless ships and sailors owed their survival to those unseen eyes in the sky. Reaching the heart of Japan. By June 1945, the reconnaissance flights reached deeper into Honshu. They photographed rail lines feeding Tokyo, bridges over the Yodo River, and coastal defenses along Shokuku. One special mission, Recon Run 134, flew directly over Hiroshima, mapping its industrial zone and nearby military headquarters. Those photos, captured weeks before the atomic bomb, would later become the before half of one of history's most infamous photographic comparisons. When analysts examined post-strike images in August, they realized the scale of destruction not through witness accounts, but through the absence of detail. Where there once were streets and shadows, there was only smooth gray dust. Psychological weight. The reconnaissance pilots bore a peculiar burden. They saw Japan from above, serene, almost beautiful, knowing that their photos would guide bombers to destroy what they had just admired. Some described the feeling as haunting. Others compartmentalized it as duty. One veteran, Captain William Jock Owen, later wrote in his diary, "The Fuji skyline looked peaceful from 30,000 feet. I remember thinking, if only we could end it with pictures instead of bombs."
Yet they continued to fly. Each mission shortened the war, even if it also deepened their unease. The final flights. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the F-5 units didn't stop immediately. They were ordered to photograph the aftermath, not for propaganda, but for scientific and strategic assessment. Pilots returned with images that would later inform reconstruction efforts and radiation studies. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, many F-5Bs still sat fueled on the tarmac, their cameras loaded. Some flew the very next day, capturing aerial records of Tokyo Bay filled with Allied ships, and the signing ceremony aboard the USS Missouri.
Aftermath and legacy. The work of those recon squadrons reshaped aerial intelligence forever. The mosaic maps they produced became the foundation for post-war cartography of Japan. U.S. occupation authorities relied on them to plan reconstruction, rebuild railways, and assess farmland. Historians later discovered that more than 4 million photographs were taken by Pacific reconnaissance units between 1943 and 1945. Many are still stored in the National Archives, their edges yellowing but their detail astonishing. Those images, mountains, rivers, ruins, remain the silent testimony of the F-5 Lightning's war. The pilots who flew them rarely received medals or headlines, but generals credited them privately. General Curtis LeMay once remarked, "Without the recon boys, our bombers would have been blind." When the last surviving F-5B was retired in 1946, few outside the units noticed. But decades later, historians revisiting the photos realized how many decisions, how many operations, how many lives had hinged on those strips of film. What began as a fighter stripped of its guns had become the ultimate weapon of knowledge, a machine that fought by seeing. And in that final irony, perhaps the F-5 Lightning achieved something nobler than any bomber or battleship ever could. It proved that in war, clarity can be more powerful than fire.
While official reports listed sorties, altitude, and camera exposure times, they never captured what it felt like to fly those missions, what it cost in nerves, friendships, and years of sleep. The pilots of the F-5B Lightning were a paradox, warriors without guns, sent into enemy skies armed only with film. Life on Saipan. Kagman Field in 1945 looked almost idyllic from afar. Palm trees, coral beaches, clear seas. But the crews who lived there described it as a furnace by day and a mosquito-ridden oven by night. Canvas tents baked under the sun, salt rusted every metal surface. Each pilot had his own small rituals before flight. Lieutenant Jack Rainey rubbed a lucky coin given by his sister. Lieutenant Bill Parrish tucked a photo of his dog under the seat. Mechanics chalked names like Lucky Lou, Pacific Ghost, or Angel Eyes onto polished noses. When a Lightning roared down the runway at dawn, ground crews always paused to watch until the silver speck vanished, half superstition, half farewell. Everyone knew that a recon pilot's job left no room for mistakes. A single engine failure hundreds of miles from land meant an empty sea and a name added to the missing list. Letters and loneliness. Mail arrived in canvas sacks once a week. Pilots queued under the awning outside the operations hut, hoping for envelopes scented faintly of home. Some letters came from wives they hadn't seen in 2 years, others from sweethearts who would soon write to say they'd married someone else. They read those letters quietly, folding and refolding the pages until the paper wore thin. Then they went back to missions that allowed no sentiment. Aerial photography demanded detachment, the horizon, the grid, the exposure. Yet even men trained to measure angles couldn't stop thinking about what their pictures would one day destroy. Loss without witness. When an F-5 failed to return, there were rarely survivors to tell what happened. The sea kept its secrets. The squadron clerk typed MIA next to a name, and a replacement was assigned the same bunk before nightfall. One entry from the 20th Reconnaissance Squadron's diary reads simply, "Lieutenant Baker overdue. Fuel exhaustion presumed. Search negative." The next line, "Weather excellent. 2 sorties completed." That detachment wasn't coldness, it was survival. To dwell too long on loss risked unraveling the thin thread of composure that kept men flying back into the blue. A rare rescue. Every now and then, fate bent in their favor. In May 1945, an F-5B returning from Taiwan lost both engines and ditched in open water. The pilot inflated his yellow dinghy and drifted for hours, using a mirror to flash sunlight toward the horizon. A Catalina flying boat spotted him and hauled him aboard, alive but silent. When someone asked what went through his mind while floating alone, he said only, "I wondered if the film was dry." The crew laughed, but they developed his camera reels that night. The pictures were perfect. An entire rail network captured in crystal clarity. He had risked his life for photographs that would soon guide bombers over the same island. Friendship in fragments. Camaraderie was strange in reconnaissance units. Because each pilot flew solo, they often spent more time together on the ground than in the air. Poker games under dim bulbs, shared bottles of captured sake, the occasional midnight swim. All attempts to remind themselves they were still human. They also shared a quiet pride. While fighter aces counted kills, recon men counted frames of film. A successful mission meant nobody died because of surprise later. Intelligence officers joked that the F-5s were the quietest killers in the Pacific, armed not with bullets, but with knowledge.
After landing, pilots taxied directly to the photographic lab huts. Film canisters, metal, frost-cold from altitude, were carried inside like treasure. Technicians developed them in total darkness, hanging miles of negatives that dripped seawater and oil. Hours later, light boxes flickered on. Teams of analysts hunched over magnifiers, murmuring coordinates and marking grids. Pilots often watched silently from the doorway, exhausted but curious to see the world they'd risked everything to capture. Some described the moment as eerie, the first human eyes to see Japan from above that day. Rail yards, temples, bomb craters, laid bare in silver light. The Japanese perspective. After the war, captured Japanese records revealed that the F-5B flights terrified local commanders. Radar operators tracked ghost planes they couldn't shoot down. Coastal observers reported contrails that vanished into the sun. Rumors spread that the Americans had invisible aircraft or mirrors in the sky. In truth, it was simply speed and altitude. The unarmed lightnings could outrun almost anything Japan had left. Their very presence signaled that the empire's skies were no longer secure. Homecoming. When peace came, the surviving pilots faced the strangest mission of all: returning home. After years of solitary flight, civilian life felt noisy and slow. Many left the service quietly, their accomplishments buried in classified reports. A few went on to careers in mapping, meteorology, or aerial photography. One pilot, Jack Rainey, later helped survey the highways that would become America's interstate system, using the same mapping principles he'd learned over Tokyo. Others never adjusted. The endless horizon had spoiled them for walls and cities. They missed the simplicity of mission and the discipline of silence. Photographs that outlived the war. In 1946, truckloads of negatives from Saipan and Guam arrived at Wright Field in Ohio. Archivists unrolled them, labeled them, and filed them away. Tens of thousands of miles of film. For decades, no one looked at them. When historians rediscovered the archive in the 1970s, they realized it was an accidental masterpiece. The entire Pacific captured frame by frame. Many images were so detailed that modern researchers still use them to locate lost ships, forgotten airstrips, and even missing soldiers. Every line of coastline, every shadowed mountain valley preserved the moment before peace returned. Legacy in the Jet Age. The lessons of the F-5Bs shaped everything that followed. The U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and even today's satellite reconnaissance all trace their lineage to those camera bays under a lightning's nose. the creed remained the same: see first, strike last. Veterans who later watched news footage from the Cold War felt a shiver of recognition. The technology had changed, but the isolation, the lonely vigil high above the world, was the same. The cost of clarity. For all its success, reconnaissance came at a quiet human cost. Many pilots struggled with insomnia, guilt, or what we now call PTSD. They hadn't pulled triggers, yet their photographs had directed devastation. Captain Owen, the pilot who once admired Mount Fuji from 30,000 feet, later confessed in a letter, quote, "We fought a war of pictures. Sometimes I dream the negatives are still hanging there, waiting for someone to choose which part of the world to burn." His words, discovered years later in an archive box, gave historians a rare glimpse of the emotional toll behind those crisp aerial images. Remembering the unarmed warriors. Today, a restored F-5B Lightning sits in a museum hangar in California, its silver skin gleaming under soft lights. Visitors peer into the empty gun bays and find only lenses, 3 circular eyes that once recorded the Pacific's final battles.
Plaques list missions and names, but not feelings. Only when veterans gather do the stories surface. Of frostbitten hands changing film at 30,000 feet, of laughter over lukewarm coffee after surviving another run, of letters written to families who would never know how close their sons had come to vanishing. One of those men, interviewed in his 90s, summed it up simply: "We didn't shoot bullets. We shot truth." In a sense, the war ended the way it was fought, from the air, through the lens of a camera. The last missions flown by F-5 crews documented Japan's surrender, the crowds lining streets, the banners of peace. The same aircraft that once mapped targets now captured history's healing. When historians develop those final reels, they still marvel at the contrast. Engines once meant for destruction, immortalizing a world finally at rest. The story of the F-5B Lightning isn't just about machinery or tactics. It's about human endurance, the price of precision, and the strange heroism of those who fought not by taking life, but by revealing truth.
While official reports listed sorties, altitude, and camera exposure times, they never captured what it felt like to fly those missions, what it cost in nerves, friendships, and years of sleep. The pilots of the F-5B Lightning were a paradox. Warriors without guns, sent into enemy skies armed only with film. Life on Saipan. Kagman Field in 1945 looked almost idyllic from afar. Palm trees, coral beaches, clear seas. But the crews who lived there described it as a furnace by day and a mosquito-ridden oven by night. Canvas tents baked under the sun, salt rusted every metal surface. Each pilot had his own small rituals before flight. Lieutenant Jack Rainey rubbed a lucky coin given by his sister. Lieutenant Bill Parrish tucked a photo of his dog under the seat. Mechanics chalked names like Lucky Lou, Pacific Ghost, or Angel Eyes onto polished noses. When a Lightning roared down the runway at dawn, ground crews always paused to watch until the silver speck vanished. Half superstition, half farewell. Everyone knew that a recon pilot's job left no room for mistakes. A single engine failure hundreds of miles from land meant an empty sea and a name added to the missing list. Letters and loneliness. Mail arrived in canvas sacks once a week. Pilots queued under the awning outside the operations hut, hoping for envelopes scented faintly of home. Some letters came from wives they hadn't seen in 2 years, others from sweethearts who would soon write to say they'd married someone else. They read those letters quietly, folding and refolding the pages until the paper wore thin. Then they went back to missions that allowed no sentiment. Aerial photography demanded detachment, the horizon, the grid, the exposure. But even men trained to measure angles couldn't stop thinking about what their pictures would one day destroy. Loss without witness. When an F-5 failed to return, there were rarely survivors to tell what happened. The sea kept its secrets. The squadron clerk typed MIA next to a name, and a replacement was assigned the same bunk before nightfall. One entry from the 20th Reconnaissance Squadron's diary simply reads, quote, "Lieutenant Baker overdue, fuel exhaustion presumed, search negative." The next line, "Weather excellent, 2 sorties completed." That detachment wasn't coldness, it was survival. To dwell too long on loss risked unraveling the thin thread of composure that kept men flying back into the blue. A rare rescue. Every now and then, fate bent in their favor. In May 1945, an F-5B returning from Taiwan lost both engines and ditched in open water. The pilot inflated his yellow dinghy and drifted for hours, using a mirror to flash sunlight toward the horizon. A Catalina flying boat spotted him and hauled him aboard, alive but silent. When someone asked what went through his mind while floating alone, he said only that he wondered if the film was dry. The crew laughed, but they developed his camera reels that night. The pictures were perfect. An entire rail network captured in crystal clarity. He had risked his life for photographs that would soon guide bombers over the same island. Camaraderie was strange in reconnaissance units. Because each pilot flew solo, they often spent more time together on the ground than in the air. Poker games under dim bulbs, shared bottles of captured sake, and the occasional midnight swim, all attempts to remind themselves they were still human. They also shared a quiet pride. While fighter aces counted kills, recon men counted frames of film. A successful mission meant nobody died because of surprise later. Intelligence officers joke that the F-5s were the quietest killers in the Pacific, armed not with bullets, but with knowledge. After landing, pilots taxied directly to the photographic lab huts. Film canisters, metal, frost-cold from altitude, were carried inside like treasure. Technicians developed them in total darkness, hanging miles of negatives that dripped seawater and oil. Hours later, light boxes flickered on. Teams of analysts hunched over magnifiers, murmuring coordinates and marking grids. Pilots often watched silently from the doorway, exhausted but curious, to see the world they'd risked everything to capture. Some described the moment as eerie, the first human eyes to see Japan from above that day. Rail yards, temples, bomb craters, laid bare in silver light.